Hello everyone, RJM3 here. Welcome back to What If, the alternate history series where I speculate what could have been if history had gone differently. In the 19th century, the great powers of the Western world, holding an uncontested monopoly over industrialization, ushered in a new age of imperialism. These empires set their sights on new lands across the globe to ensure they wouldn't fall behind their rivals. And one of those lands that became of particular interest for the great powers was China.
During this period, commonly known as the Century of Humiliation, concession after concession was demanded from the Qing dynasty by Western powers. This era began with the outbreak of the First Opium War. After a Qing official had seized opium smuggled in by the British in Canton, the British Empire declared war and utilized their greater industrial and military capabilities to effortlessly defeat the Chinese. At the Treaty of Nanking, the Qing were demanded to restore the British right to trade opium in Canton, establish new treaty ports in several Chinese cities, cede the city of Hong Kong to the British Empire, and pay massive reparations. In 1850, the outbreak of the Taiping Rebellion, in which a man claiming to be the brother of Jesus Christ started a holy war against the Qing dynasty to convert China to his bizarre version of Christianity, only further rattled Chinese prestige. The devastation of the Taiping Rebellion coincided with the outbreak of the Second Opium War, which was basically a repeat of the First Opium War, except this time the French also joined in on the beating. This, of course, led to further territorial concessions and the granting of greater economic and diplomatic freedoms to the great powers within China. The Qing would again be defeated by foreigners in the Sino-French War and the First Sino-Japanese War. By the 1890s, many of the great powers had established spheres of influence within China. All of this national humiliation in such a relatively short amount of time left the average Chinese peasant pretty resentful. Around 50,000 to 100,000 of these resentful peasants formed their own militia, the Yehuchan, or the Fists of Harmony and Justice, known to most Westerners as the Boxers. In 1899, the Boxers rose up across the North China Plain, attacking Christian missionaries, Chinese Christians, and foreign nationals. On June 20th, 1900, the Boxers began to lay siege to the foreign legation quarter in Beijing. Seeing the lives of their own citizens in danger, the great powers, in a rare moment of unity and cooperation, formed a coalition to rescue their citizens trapped in the foreign legation quarter and to put down the Boxer Rebellion, the Eight-Nation Alliance. It was comprised of the United Kingdom, the United States, Germany, France, Russia, Japan, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. The Netherlands, Belgium, and Spain were also there, but they were never officially part of the alliance. Meanwhile, the ruling Empress Dowager of the Qing dynasty, Cixi, actually sided with the Boxers and declared war on all of the invading nations. For 55 days in the summer of 1900, the Boxers besieged the legation quarter. In mid-August, the alliance finally arrived in Beijing to save their people. The Boxers, who were used to killing helpless civilians when faced up against an actual army that could actually fight back, got their butts handed to them.
With the Boxers defeated, the Empress forced to flee the capital, and all the great powers' armies occupying Chinese soil all at once, it was the closest China ever came to being partitioned and colonized, just like Africa had been 15 years before. But then, nothing happened. Why?
Well, to understand why the alliance chose not to colonize China, we have to understand the open door policy. In the aftermath of the Spanish-American War and the American acquisition of the Philippines, American businesses expanded the United States' economic interests across Asia, especially in China. U.S. Ambassador William Woodville Rockhill, observing the great powers establish spheres of influence within Chinese territory, began to worry that Europe was about to carve up China like a melon, thus locking the United States out of any Chinese markets. To prevent this from happening, Rockhill created the open door policy, which dictated a system of equal trade and investment among the great powers within China and a guarantee of Chinese territorial integrity going forward. When the Boxer Rebellion broke out, U.S. Secretary of State John Hay sent letters to all of the other nations in the alliance asking them to abide by the open door policy, and surprisingly, almost every other nation complied. You see, if China was actually partitioned, not only would America be denied from entering any new Chinese markets, but so would everyone else. Any nation with colonies in China would be stuck with only the mines, railroads, and trading ports within their own territory and be unable to access any Chinese markets outside of it. On October 6, 1900, the United Kingdom and the German Empire signed the Yangtze Agreement, cementing their commitment to not seek territorial concessions from the Qing. On September 7, 1900, the Boxer Rebellion came to an official end with the signing of the Boxer Protocol, which demanded large monetary reparations from the Qing to the Eight-Nation Alliance, among other punitive measures, but no territorial concessions were made, save for a few square blocks in Tianjin. However, the Russian Empire was too invested in building railroads and nabbing warm water ports in Manchuria to care about any American ideals, but their plans to annex Manchuria and puppet Korea swiftly ended with their defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. From that point onward, the great powers lost interest and expanded their influence over China. Well, almost every great power. In 1911, the Qing dynasty collapsed into revolution. After suffering years of civil war, invasion, famine, and despotism for much of the 20th century, China has since recovered its status as a great power. For better or for worse.
But what if in an alternate timeline, the open door policy wasn't able to save China? What if the great powers ignored the economic issues that would come with a partition? What if there had been a scramble for China? 1900. History diverges after Hay sends out his letters to the other powers. In this alternate timeline, there is a greater level of doubt and cynicism between the eight nations over whether or not they can trust each other to not seize land from China after the Boxers are defeated. If any power believes any of their competitors won't abide by the open door policy, then why should they? Every single nation, not just Russia, promptly rebukes Hay's suggestion. To prevent any further distrust from going out of hand and tearing the eight-nation alliance apart, a new conference is held between representatives of each nation, a conference not too different from the Berlin Conference that decided how Africa was to be divided. It is formally agreed upon exactly how to partition China after the war is over. Now, based on the pre-established spheres of influence, this is what I believe is the most likely way China will be partitioned. In the south, the French, expanding from their colony in Indochina, take the provinces of Yunnan, Guizhou, Guangxi, the western part of Guangdong, and Hainan Island. The British would take the entire Yangtze River basin from Shanghai in southern Jiangsu to Chongqing in Sichuan. From Hong Kong, the British carve another colony out of the remaining eastern half of Guangdong and extend it to Hunan and Jiangxi to connect it to the Yangtze River colony. The British would also annex the tip of the Shandong Peninsula because there they had leased the city of Weihai back in 1898. Tibet would also be taken in by the British, not as a colony, but as a protectorate. Fujian, being directly across from Japanese Formosa, would be annexed by Japan. Italy, despite having no spheres of influence in China, would get domain over the Zhejiang province because of a prior national embarrassment for Italy when they tried to pressure the Qing into leasing them the Sanman Bay, which was located in Zhejiang, but they failed. So this would be kind of a fitting revenge. The German Empire would take the rest of the Shandong province from their own leased city of Qingdao. Germany would extend their colony as far as possible across central China to maintain the balance of power with Britain, from northern Jiangsu to eastern Gansu. The Russians take the largest piece of the pie, annexing East Turkestan, Inner Mongolia, Outer Mongolia, Manchuria, and pretty much everything else deep in the interior of China that no one else wanted. The Japanese would still be pretty upset with the Russians taking Manchuria, but they would be permitted to establish a protectorate over Korea to appease them. Finally, as for the province of Zili, no one could agree who would get the honor and prestige of occupying the Chinese capital itself, so it would be agreed upon that Zili would be jointly occupied by all of the great powers except for the United States, who never even wanted China to be colonized in the first place. So the conference concludes, and the war plays out exactly as it did in our timeline, and China is divided accordingly. The Qing retreating into the interior of China would attempt to rally a resistance movement. Once the eight-nation alliance starts to occupy large parts of the country, rebellions could break out all across China. But sooner or later, any pro-Qing resistance is stamped out by the great powers. Following the division of China, the economies of the great powers are negatively impacted.
As mentioned earlier, their capacity to extract revenue and resources from Chinese markets has been limited as Western businesses can only operate on Chinese soil controlled by their own respective countries. That isn't even mentioning the fact that the cost of funding a permanent garrison in these colonies would be pretty expensive. Occupying forces would be continuously harassed by nationalist Chinese revolutionaries and clandestine activities. With a written treaty agreed upon by all of the great powers definitively laying out Russia and Japan's borders, the Russo-Japanese War would have been averted, sparing the Russian Empire from a humiliating defeat and the failed 1905 Russian Revolution, as well as continuing Russian access to Port Arthur in Manchuria. Japan would not be too happy with this arrangement. While they may have gotten Korea 5 years sooner and even have a foothold in mainland China, the Japanese public would not be too comfortable with the parent of Eastern civilization being defeated and dismantled by the Europeans. In the late 19th century, a new idea had been going around known as Pan-Asianism, which basically believed all Asian countries should unite to resist European imperialism. The Japanese Empire, being the only Asian country who took industrialization seriously and became a superpower, came to view themselves as leading this hypothetical Pan-Asian alliance, or Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. In our timeline, this idea eventually warped into the Japanese viewing themselves as the master race and having to forge their own empire across Asia to kick out the Europeans, culminating in the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Pacific theater of World War II. But in this alternate timeline, with Europe now at its doorstep, the development of such an idea is accelerated. With the outbreak of World War I in 1914, Japan sees a special opportunity to liberate Asia. In our timeline, Japan sided with the Entente powers in August 1914 to opportunistically seize German territory in China and the Pacific. But in this alternate timeline, Japanese leadership instead reasons that because the Entente holds more territory in China, more of Asia can be liberated if Japan sides against them. So Japan instead joins the Central Powers. They fight alongside the Germans in China and snatch up many British and French-controlled islands in the Pacific. This leads to catastrophic results for the Entente. More manpower must be diverted to Asia to prevent the Japanese from conquering China, which only distracts the Entente from the fight in Europe. As a result, World War I could be prolonged into the early 1920s. But due to an overall greater industrial capacity of the Entente, the Russian Empire being able to hold out from collapse for a little while longer without the 1905 revolution, and the eventual entry of the United States, the Entente would still win the war in the end, but at a much greater cost. Millions of people who would have otherwise lived are killed. The economies and infrastructure of the great powers are destroyed even worse than in our timeline. All of the extra trauma and ruin inflicted by the war could push more people into more extreme ideologies. The borders of Europe and Africa are redrawn even less favorably for the Central Powers than in our timeline. Reparation payments are even worse. As for Asia, Britain takes away Germany and Japan's colonies in China and seizes the Zili International Zone. Korea is made into a British protectorate. Like the Philippines, Taiwan is temporarily made into a U.S. territory. Like Germany, Japan is utterly humiliated in the peace treaty, being stripped of its military and forced to pay enormous reparations. From the 1920s onwards, it gets difficult to predict exactly how world politics would play out. It's possible that a number of major historical figures who fought on the front lines of World War I, such as Adolf Hitler, Winston Churchill, and Harry S. Truman, could have been killed. If any of these are the case, then Germany could come to embrace a different ideology other than National Socialism. Britain might agree to settle for a white peace in an alternate World War II. The United States could decide not to use nuclear weapons in such a conflict. But those are all just maybes. Generally speaking, the economic conditions that would lead to a Great Depression and the geopolitical conditions that would lead to a Second World War would still be there. Out of the destruction of this timeline's version of World War II, the old powers of Europe would still likely fade into irrelevance and begin the process of decolonization. Returning our focus to China, it is left partitioned by the Europeans as several smaller countries. Given the threat of communism from the Soviet Union, many of the regimes in what was formerly China are propped up by the United States. This timeline's version of the Vietnam War may not be in Vietnam, but rather in Zili, the Yangtze, or Canton. It's highly doubtful that China would ever reunify. Having spent decades separated by different empires and heavily influenced by Western ideas of politics and nationality, each new country would have developed their own unique identity and culture outside of being Han Chinese. This comes with many positives, but also a couple major downsides. On one hand, the former colonies in China would have never undergone the disastrous Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution under the Chinese Communist Party. Hong Kong would remain a bastion of democracy in Asia. The Uyghurs would have never faced persecution at the hands of a genocidal regime in Beijing. Several third world countries are never forced into Chinese debt traps, and American corporations would have a harder time finding a place where they can outsource millions of American jobs. On the other hand, the ex-colonies would remain underdeveloped third world countries, leaving over 1 billion of formerly Chinese people in poverty, and a vibrant culture and civilization that lasted for thousands of years simply ceases to exist. Whether or not this timeline is overall better or worse off than our own is up for you to decide.
I hope you all enjoyed today's video. I'm sorry about the 2-month delay. I should probably stop promising confident upload dates so early into production. Stay tuned for next time, where we'll explore what would have happened if the Russian Federation had a functioning democracy. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and follow me on Instagram. This has been RJM3, Alternate Historian. Have a nice day.